Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis. This week, we're going to look at Nixon, both in terms of his being elected to the presidency, on a groundswell of conservative reaction to the 1960s, and then we're also going to look at Richard Nixon's foreign policy, both with the Soviet Union, China, and of course also with the Vietnam War, and then of course we will also look at the Watergate scandal. So Richard Nixon rose to the White House as he ran for the presidency another time, the last time being the significant 1960 election. Richard Nixon ran in 1968 against Hubert Humphrey, but also, of course, against Bobby Kennedy before he was assassinated, and of course against Eugene McCarthy as well. Richard Nixon was really at the forefront of a group of individuals that were riding a wave, a conservative reaction to the 1960s. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, who became governor of California in the late 60s, George Wallace, the controversial Alabama governor who opposed desegregation, and of course did so on the principle of states' rights. These political figures were all part of a nationwide reaction to the 60s, to the controversy of the anti-war movement, to the controversy of the Vietnam War, to the images of the counterculture, and so forth. The conservative reaction is also seen in music, particularly country music, recorded by famous artists like Merle Haggard, of course, who probably his most famous sort of statement of the conservative perspective on anti-war and counterculture was, of course, the song "The Okie from Muskogee." There was the hard hat movement, which was basically conservative individuals who went out protesting the protesters, advocating support for American policies. October 1965, there was a 25,000 person march in support of U.S. policy. So this has kind of been channeling alongside of the anti-war movement and the counterculture. As anti-war movement, as the counterculture developed, we see a rather robust conservative reaction that Nixon will call, when he runs for the presidency in 1968, he will call this kind of now increasingly united conservative movement the silent majority. And Richard Nixon's silent majority was based more than anything else on the idea of promoting peace with honor in Vietnam and assuring law and order at home. This is really his message in the election. He says he had a plan to obtain peace in Vietnam. He won't really tell anybody what the plan is, but he claims that we will be able to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam and that he will bring law and order to the streets of the United States, which was something with all of the civil rights protests and violence and the anti-war protests and controversy in the streets, particularly the Democratic Convention of 1968, which turned into a police riot. The Democratic Convention of 1968 really was not so. It wasn't violence caused first and foremost by protesters. It's generally regarded as a police riot, but nonetheless, Americans, see these types of things as indicators of the failings of the current leadership, and so they gravitate towards Nixon, who will win, of course, in the election of 1968 against Hubert Humphrey, largely on his appeal to peace with honor in Vietnam and law and order at home. Conservative worldview is really centered around two branches. You see Barry Goldwater here, pictured here. I have him here because he's kind of a good example of more of a libertarian conservative. Libertarians believe in unregulated free market capitalism. They define freedom around economics and property rights. And libertarians, of course, promote a very, very hands-off approach and generally regard problems in the 60s and today in the 21st century as the result of government meddling. Libertarians tend to fear strong government because they believe that strong government is a threat to property rights, which many libertarians regard property rights and economic freedom as the ultimate natural right. Moral conservatives, on the other hand, tend to be more normative in their outlook. They have ideal perspective. They are fearful of a weakening of the moral fabric of the country. And so moral conservatives were particularly revolted by concepts of free love and things like this associated with the counterculture. Moral conservatives are generally fearful of a weakening of the moral fabric of the country. And so they tend to promote family values. They promote more traditional gender and sexual norms in reaction to like the really driving part of those old 1950 norms by the counterculture in the United States. And of course, many moral conservatives, following evangelical preachers, for example, maybe like Billy Graham, believe that fundamentally the problem with the nation was that it had become increasingly unrighteous, and that the nation had to kind of, tap into its moral Christian roots in some cases, as it has become depraved. In the 1960s, there were a myriad of very significant challenges to the conservative worldview. Miranda rights. Now, on the surface, we might say, how is it that Miranda rights were a challenge to conservative worldview? Of course, Miranda rights, I'm sure every one of you have been arrested. Joking. Hopefully none of us have been arrested. But if you were ever arrested, you would have your Miranda rights read to you. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to attorney. If you cannot afford one, the court will appoint attorney, etc., etc. In the 60s, of course, there was a famous Supreme Court decision that effectively asserted that Miranda rights had to be made known to any person being arrested. And many conservatives opposed this because it was seen as something that was strapping law enforcement officials. It was seen as something that was making the job of law enforcement officials more difficult. Somehow it was labeling law enforcement officials as somehow responsible for abuses when rather they should be supported by the people for the necessary law and order that they provide. The issue of sexual privacy, of birth control, the birth control pill, of course, was a revolution for women seeking greater sexual freedom, seeking greater freedom over their reproduction. But of course, the birth control also was something that very much brought the ire of many moral conservatives who saw it as something that promoted promiscuity and these types of things. And of course, Roe v. Wade, which will be the famous Supreme Court decision in the early 70s, which upholds a woman's right to choose with respect to terminating a pregnancy, was sort of a culmination of the women's movement, seeking sexual and reproductive freedom in the 60s. And of course, the Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court in the early 70s will continue and today remains as the sort of core issue for many moral conservatives today. So we see these types of developments really beginning in the 60s. Prayer in schools. Of course, in the 60s, there was a famous Supreme Court decision that found that it was unconstitutional to have prayers in public schools. This was something, again, that brought the ire of many moral conservatives. Civil rights. Many conservatives promote states' rights attitudes, and they see, for example, in the case of somebody like George Wallace in Alabama, they see, federal institution of civil rights and desegregation and of voting rights as a violation of states' rights. And they oppose it largely on the notion that it represented to them an expansion of federal power that was in violation of the rights of particular states to deal with those types of issues on their own. Conservatives react to these types of issues with very strict constructionist approach. Conservatives were very anti-statist, meaning that they were opposed to federal power being used as a regulatory agency, and instead believed in states' rights, limited government, and at most local and state government. They were opposed to, federal actions or programs that went across the power of the individual states. So they're strict constructionists of the Constitution. Some might also call this, some who are strict constructionists will call it originalism. They are, as a movement in the 60s, quite paranoid about communism, and so anti-communism and increasing federal power became things that many in the conservative movement, came to sort of associate as similar. The conservative movement was unified, really, in the late 60s, and the context of this unification, meaning that the libertarian strands, which typically are less interested in a lot of aspects of the moral conservative side, and the moral conservative side, they're unified in the 60s. And a big reason why they're unified is because of what they see with the anti-war movement, with the counterculture, with festivals like Woodstock or things like the acid test. They're unified around civil rights and the idea that that civil rights somehow represented an expansion of federal power that undermined states' rights and was a ground for a further expansion of federal power, and thus a potential threat to aspects of freedom within potential states. The Watts riots in 1965 in Southern California, and of course thereafter the formation of the Black Panthers. Ronald Reagan became a champion of gun control in California, primarily because they were trying to effectively take guns out of the hands of the Black Panthers, who in the late 60s kind of organized a police their own communities movement, in which they armed themselves and they policed the street corners in areas like Oakland, for example, in California, armed in response to what they saw as systemic abuse by largely white police officers. Another factor in the unification of the conservative movement was the Democratic National Convention of 1968. In 1968, a huge police riot, as historians call it, ensued outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And this was Mayor Daley's city. Mayor Daley had effectively organized the National Guard and riot police to take whatever method necessary to prevent protesters from approaching the DNC, and in the process, a huge police riot ensues. It's all over the TV. People are getting nightsticked and beat up and thrown into paddy wagons, and it just looks terrible for the Democrats and Hubert Humphrey. So it wasn't as though Republicans somehow opposed using police force to prevent protests, but simply that it just further made the DNC look like it was associated with the violence and unrest of the 1960s. Of course, there's also a common enemy for conservatives, moral and economic or libertarians, and that was liberalism. And so the two worldviews really meet around these basic principles. Economics. Conservatives generally oppose wealth redistribution and welfare programs. Nationalism and sort of the mythic vision of the nation's founding, memory. Conservatives tended to claim authority to the founding fathers, which they believed justified their needs and ideals, and which they believed the current country was moving away from. There's also, shared by both sides, a fear of federal government and a promotion of localism and states' rights. And so both libertarians and moral conservatives could agree on strict constructionist principles. So even though Richard Nixon rode into the White House claiming to have a path to peace with honor in Vietnam, Vietnam during Nixon's presidency did not become less significant. In reality, it became even more significant publicly. More bombs were dropped during Nixon's period in Vietnam. Cambodia and Laos were opened up to direct interventions by the United States and their ally. We dropped bombs in a much less regulated fashion. And so Vietnam, even though Richard Nixon, pledged peace with honor, and even though Richard Nixon began withdrawing troops, there were certain aspects of Richard Nixon's policy that were escalated, and indeed the Vietnam War publicly became even more controversial. And perhaps the perfect example of this controversy is the My Lai massacre, which went public in 1969. And here you see, of course, the cover magazine from Time, the cover from Time magazine, the cover story. My Lai, this was a case of American soldiers committing war crimes. And what had happened was, this happened at the end of Johnson's presidency. This is during the Tet Offensive in 1968. And Charlie Company, a group of American soldiers, were ordered into an area around the village of My Lai, and around the general area of My Lai. And this area was referred to by soldiers as Pinkville. It was an area associated with a tremendous amount of communist infiltration. It was also labeled a free fire zone by policymakers on the ground, meaning that anybody that was in this area would be considered effectively complicit in the Viet Cong and thereby a target and an enemy. With the My Lai massacre, soldiers who had suffered some casualties near the area recently, the group was very, very frustrated. And they went into this village, and ultimately American soldiers killed upwards of 400 to 500 civilians in execution style. These are some of the images from the My Lai massacre. And this came out in 1969. Again, it happens under the watch of Johnson, but it was released at the beginning of Nixon's presidency, and it will become hugely controversial during Nixon's first couple of years. And again, it was a case in which Americans had, regardless of the nature of the war, Americans had, led most by Lieutenant William Calley and Ernest Medina, Americans had gone into a village and had clearly conducted, atrocities in murdering several hundred civilians in execution fashion. Okay, these people weren't armed or fighting back. And so it became a huge controversy when this story goes public in 1969. At My Lai, Colonel Ernest Medina had really been the person who ordered the operation from the top, if you will. Lieutenant William Calley was on the ground, and he was, to a degree, following the directive of Ernest Medina. This was a free fire zone. You were sent into an area assuming that all you would encounter would be enemy. And of course, however things transpired, Lieutenant William Calley led a group of soldiers, not all of them in the Charlie Company, a group of them in a massacre of several hundred people. And it should be noted that this is not, all Americans did not behave like this in Vietnam. And in fact, you see here pictured Hugh Thompson. Hugh Thompson was a great example of an American at the time who did the right thing. Hugh Thompson saw what was going on. He was flying a helicopter, and he forced the killing to stop. Actually threatened to shoot Calley because Calley tried to tell Thompson that this wasn't his place, this wasn't his scene, and he needed to get out of there. And Thompson ultimately saved a young child and told Calley that either they would stop or he would turn their guns on Calley and the other individuals of his platoon perpetrating this massacre. This says a lot about problems with American policy in Vietnam, how to deal with a guerrilla war that operates in and around villages. And atrocities like this, while this was probably the largest scale and certainly most publicized, this type of thing, killing of civilians, was something that happened it's something that happened in South Vietnam far more than Americans, I'm sure, would like to admit. There's numerous veteran stories of shooting an old woman running away because she's afraid of the Americans. And, of course, the mantra of the kill count and the idea that if it's dead, it's VC, were part and parcel to the problems with policy that allowed for this type of thing to happen. Now, Callie's court-martialed, and it's a huge, huge public affair. People wrote songs about Callie's court-martial. Actually, in the period from in the early 70s, for about a year and a half, songs about Lieutenant William Callie were a really, really common and popular aspect of artists who voiced their opinions about America's Vietnam War. Many of them supported Callie. There's probably more pro-Callie songs than there were anti-Callie songs. And that was largely because Americans had the sense that Callie was being made a patsy. That, in fact, Callie was following orders, and that if anybody was really responsible for it, it was the policymakers who put in place this type of policy. Callie is court-martialed, and he's given life imprisonment. Ultimately, Callie's pardoned by Nixon. He served about a year in prison. He's pardoned by Nixon in an action that was hugely controversial, but one that a lot of Americans really supported because they felt that Callie was being unfairly made a patsy, regardless of the heinous nature of his acts. He was being made a patsy for a bigger problem with American policy in Vietnam. Richard Nixon's plan, as it plays out for peace with honor, looks about more like this. So be more aggressive in the war in general. So under Nixon, you will see bombing in a much less regulated manner. Henry Kissinger, the United States does not really move away from the idea of the Johnson administration that we were trying to find the enemy's breaking point. Instead, you see Henry Kissinger ultimately being quoted as any fourth-rate nation has a breaking point. This statement by Kissinger, private statement by Kissinger, really demonstrates the idea that the Nixon plan was to continue to escalate the force to try to find the point whereby North Vietnam can be forced to the table to negotiate. Very similar to the Johnson's program. Dissimilar to the Johnson program was invading border areas of Cambodia and Laos. So the Nixon administration will expand the war. While it is trying to pull Americans out, it uses both Americans and Vietnamese, South Vietnamese soldiers to expand the war, opening the war up in a more direct way into Cambodia, which was a neutral country, and Laos. Two countries that had been inadvertently implicated in the war. The Nixon administration will expand the war, seeking to destroy the infiltration points used by the Viet Cong. The other side of the Nixon plan is to continue what's called Vietnamization, which was the idea of turning the war over to the Vietnamese. In truth, this was the same thing Johnson was trying to do in the last year or so of his presidency. Turn the war over to the Vietnamese, train them to do the fighting, and withdraw Americans as you do that, and increase the bombing campaigns to give the South Vietnamese army, the ARVN, to give them the sort of strength of American air power to kind of make it all work. What makes the plan possible more than anything else is Richard Nixon's reliance on great power diplomacy. A key thing for Nixon wanted to be able to expand the war without the concern or controversy with a larger conflict with the Soviets or the Chinese, something that had really concerned, of course, the Johnson administration, and had really led them to really limit the bombing campaign and operations there in South Vietnam. Richard Nixon promotes a positive relationship with the Soviets and also the Chinese as a way of basically leveraging them to be less sort of active about their concerns over Vietnam. His rationale was that if the superpowers are getting along, then the superpowers won't really care what happens to little third world, developing world, I should say, country in Southeast Asia. And so Nixon kind of opens up to the Russians. He develops a positive relationship with Leonid Brezhnev. He pushes through with the Soviets the signing of the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, which was a treaty that limited nuclear and ballistic missile technology. They pushed through the ABM Treaty, which was a treaty that banned the development of anti-ballistic missile systems. This was very, very important too, by the way, to the SALT Treaty, because ultimately the agreement on the ABM Treaty was that they didn't want one side or the other to make an anti-ballistic missile system that could then encourage the side that didn't have it to build a whole bunch of nuclear weapons so that they could build so many that it could override the ballistic missile system. And so if you agreed to not develop those systems, then neither side would be encouraged to undertake a more massive nuclear arms buildup out of a hope to be able to override that system if a war in fact occurred. So those were really critical agreements between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and they encouraged the Soviet Union to be less stringent over issues of Vietnam. Nixon begins the opening of the door with China. He famously visits China in a huge publicized event. And ultimately, of course, through the Ford to the Jimmy Carter administrations, the United States begins the path towards recognition of the Maoist government of China, which ultimately, of course, leads to the current trade relationship that the United States and China possess today. In 1969, General Creighton Abrams recommended, he took over after Westmoreland, and so after the Tet Offensive, Westmoreland is out, and General Creighton Abrams is brought in to oversee operations in Vietnam. Creighton Abrams kind of moved the United States away from the major search and destroy operations. He wanted to limit casualties. We went to smaller sort of patrols and away from the huge search and destroy missions that Westmoreland had promoted. But Abrams in 1969 proposes a major operation into Cambodia. Cambodia was a huge infiltration point for the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong ally, and Abrams believed if we could launch an incursion into Cambodia that it could ultimately take out the center of the operational headquarters of the Viet Cong and the NVA in Cambodia. This is a frustration of the war that the enemy operated from a neutral country of Cambodia and that we couldn't do anything about it. Nixon obsesses over the decision. It was opposed by both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, largely because of the nature of the target in one respect, but also because of the almost inevitable political consequences. And Nixon tried to keep it secret, though ultimately it would be impossible to keep the bombing of Cambodia secret and then the actual incursion of Cambodia secret. And so he'll announce it on the news, and the results would be massive protests. The idea behind the Cambodia incursion was that we believed there was a center headquarters, Cos Vinh, that was the command center of the NVA in Cambodia. In reality, it probably wasn't much of what we would consider a headquarters at all. It was probably nothing more than a couple of radios and a foxhole. And many also considered the infiltration points around Laos to be far more significant because of their proximity to the north. But Nixon is trying to use this not only as a method of obtaining an actual military objective, i.e. taking out Cos Vinh, but also he's trying to send a political message to the North. He wants the North to see that he will escalate, that he's not afraid to conduct the war in a more aggressive fashion, and that he will do this. And so, and a lot of this is Nixon, saber rattling and also buying time for Vietnamization. The ARVN in the South were not ready or properly equipped to really fight the campaign on their own. And so this type of operation could potentially buy a window for increasing training of the ARVN in South Vietnam. On April 30th, 1970, Nixon will announce the Cambodian incursion. And the result is massive student protests. 500 schools across the country were closed because of anti-war protests. ROTC buildings burned, even at places like the University of Kentucky, which was, more of a conservative institution, if you will. It wasn't as associated with anti-war protests as you might think about like UC Berkeley or something. But even there you saw students torching the ROTC buildings. At Kent State, there is really an accidental engagement in which National Guardsmen were brought into Kent State University in Ohio, were brought in to subdue the protesters. And through a series of events that's somewhat difficult to know, there were shots fired from the Guardsmen into a group of students at Kent State University, and it results in 4 students being shot dead. In some cases, these students were just walking to class. Some of the victims weren't even actually involved in the protests, but the National Guardsmen had been on maneuvers for a day. They hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and regardless of the circumstance of events, whether rocks were thrown or what, for whatever reason, there were shots fired, and 4 students are killed on Kent State's campus. There were also a similar event that occurred in Jackson State University. At this point, Congress, the media, and the anti-war are so enraged by this action because Cambodia was a neutral nation. Now, the United States facilitated the overthrow of that neutral government, which was led by an individual named Prince Norodom Sihanouk. And we put in power a military leader that was a close ally of ours who would fight the war in Cambodia along with us. But people are upset because they don't really understand that. And also, Nixon was promoting a plan for peace. And instead of that plan, we're seeing the war expanded in the Americans are seeing the war expanded. And American soldiers are fighting and dying in a new theater of combat. And so the fact that it was a neutral country, which we had been bombing in secret since 1969, I will say, but the fact that it was a neutral country, the fact that American troops have been sent into really an expansion of the war, were hugely controversial, and was a big reason why we saw such intense protests that were held all across the country, particularly on college campuses. The Cambodian incursion, really, for all its hopes, was really a failure. There was never a location of Cosvin. In truth, that's probably a couple radios and a foxhole, as I mentioned earlier. But there is no great headquarters that's captured. Cambodia will now descend into a civil war, and the United States will put its support behind a military regime that we were supporting, the one that we put in power following the overthrow, which we backed, of the neutral government of Prince Norodom Sihanouk, the leadership under Lon Nol, who was our new ally. We would support them in fighting the communists in Cambodia. The problem is that now Cambodia is in a civil war, and the writing on the wall for American involvement in Vietnam is really starting to be pretty clear that our time is numbered there. And so what happens is when the United States pulls out of Vietnam, now not only will we see the conquest of South Vietnam eventually, but you'll also see Cambodia descend into a massive genocide in which the fanatical Khmer Rouge, which actually the North Vietnamese invaded Cambodia trying to prevent this after the United States was gone. The Khmer Rouge began one of the worst genocides in human history, killing 25% of the entire population of Cambodia as it sought to create a radical communist agrarian utopia, I guess, is probably how they thought about it. The United States also opened up Laos to the war. Before the operation into Laos in 1970, 71, I'm sorry, before the operation into Laos, which was an ARVN operation that utterly fails, we had been undertaking the largest paramilitary operation in the history of the country, where the CIA and their covert airline, Air America, have been used to funnel supplies and train the Hmong people, which were the sort of mountain people of the areas of Laos near the border of Vietnam, who were to fight both the communists of the NVA from the north, as well as the Pathet Lao, which were the Laotian communists who were fighting alongside the NVA in Laos. So the expansion of this conflict doesn't find solutions, actually. In reality, it expands the war, and the consequences for this expansion of the war were pretty devastating when the war is ultimately over, particularly for individuals who supported the Americans, and in general for the population of Cambodia, as we will see the fanatical Khmer Rouge come to power following the exit of the United States and its aid. At home in 1971, it's increasingly a controversial period. Former Secretary of State John Kerry and the Vietnam Veterans Against the War organized the Winter Soldier March in D.C. Veterans threw their medals back at the Capitol. They lay down on major roadways to disrupt traffic and to demonstrate an opposition to the Vietnam War, and particularly an expansion of the war into Cambodia and also Laos. There were mobs and riots in Washington, D.C., and of course, in 1971, we see the first excerpts released from the New York Times of the Pentagon Papers, which was leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, who you see pictured here. This is, of course, a current picture of Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg worked in the Defense Department and, of course, was associated with leaking the Pentagon report that detailed all of the failures of American policy in Vietnam. And, of course, this came out, and it wasn't really damning to the Nixon administration, but it was very damning to Johnson and Kennedy. Illegal operations, continuing bombing when we know it's not working, these types of things, which were highly controversial and which kind of drew the whole paradigm of Vietnam into question. The Nixon administration was absolutely infuriated over Daniel Ellsberg, though they don't have him arrested or prosecuted because it would have been politically unpopular. The Nixon administration had the plumbers break into his doctor's clinic to try to steal his medical records out of a hope of smearing Daniel Ellsberg in one of the many, many illegal actions that were conducted by the Nixon administration. Lieutenant William Calley in 1971 was sentenced to life in prison, found guilty of 22 counts of murder, of war crimes, basically. Of course, he will ultimately be pardoned by Nixon. He only serves about a year in prison, and he will receive a pardon by Richard Nixon. Nixon's bombing campaigns, the two biggest examples of his bombing campaigns were in response to the Northern Offensive of 1972, the so-called Eastertide Offensive, which lasted from March to October 1972. It was a massive conventional approach in which the North tried to launch a three-pronged offensive, one from the north, one from Cambodia, and one from areas of Laos, in an attempt to overrun the South. And it is halted largely because of Richard Nixon's use of a very intense and aggressive bombing campaign, Operation Linebacker 1. And here you see, during the Eastertide Offensive, down here in the bottom corner, this is a very famous picture from the era called The Girl in the Picture sometimes, this young girl she's naked because there's been a napalm strike that's hit close to her village, and it burned all of the clothes off of her. And, of course, this became one of the most infamous images of the latter stages of America's involvement in Vietnam. Nixon uses what you might call the madman approach, or the good cop, bad cop approach. Henry Kissinger, who begins as a national security advisor and then ultimately becomes his Secretary of State, he would go and he would talk with the North Vietnamese or to Brezhnev. He would talk to Le Duc Tho, who was the ambassador, the primary diplomat involved in negotiating with Kissinger, and he would say, "Look, Nixon's a madman. He's crazy. I don't know what he'll do." And then if the other side would not, kind of do anything, then Nixon would respond with a more expanded bombing campaign. And then Kissinger would come back and say, "See, look, he's crazy. We should sign an agreement now. Otherwise, who knows what Nixon might bomb." This was kind of an intentional approach by Nixon, coupled with his sort of superpower diplomacy to try to, find peace with honor in Vietnam, to try to get the North Vietnamese and get the Soviets to pressure the North Vietnamese to come to the peace table and sign an agreement that was acceptable to the United States. In Linebacker 1, we see heavy bombing of North Vietnam as well as in South Vietnam to counter the offensive. Nixon does stuff that Johnson would never have done. He mined the harbor of Haiphong, which Johnson had always been fearful of doing for concerns of antagonizing the Soviets. It was an unprecedented level of conflict escalation, and B-52s bombed the North quite heavily until October of 1972. The results, relatively positive if you look at it from the standards of what the United States hoped to achieve. The Eastern Tide Offensive fails. The USSR and the Chinese are more cautious, especially given Nixon's overtures to both using his superpower, his great power diplomacy. The problem, though, is still evident that the South still needs the U.S. for survival. This is just the reality. And so as a result of this has delayed the eventuality of the collapse of South Vietnam, but South Vietnam is still not even close to being able to operate without American support. So that's really still the key problem. In 1972, the United States was engaged in secret talks with Le Duc Tho, the diplomat, the North Vietnamese diplomat. Henry Kissinger, in the peace talks, he was much more pessimistic than Richard Nixon about the potential future of an independent South Vietnam long term. And so Henry Kissinger was hoping to achieve what he called, quote, a decent interval. And what he meant by that was that he wanted to obtain a peace that allowed South Vietnam to exist long enough for the Nixon administration and Henry Kissinger to not be kind of held responsible for losing South Vietnam to communism. But Kissinger was much more pessimistic about any long-term independence of South Vietnam. He hoped to negotiate with Le Duc Tho and achieve a decent interval of time before the eventual collapse of South Vietnam. Here you see Kissinger kind of gleefully holding the Time magazine that celebrates him winning the Nobel Peace Prize for the Paris Peace Agreement, which was signed at the beginning of 1973. It should be noted that Le Duc Tho refused that prize. Le Duc Tho said that there was not peace, the war was not over, and he refused the prize as a sort of symbolic gesture. In the South, Nguyen Van Thu, who's the South Vietnamese president, it was kept completely out of the loop. Kissinger is holding these talks in secret. Nguyen Van Thu doesn't know the talks are going on, and frankly, Henry Kissinger is rather dismissive of the goals of the South Vietnamese president. And Nixon and Kissinger have very different goals with respect to South Vietnam. Nixon really wanted to be there for Thu. He did not want to sort of risk leaving the South stranded. Whereas Henry Kissinger was really more focused on getting an agreement, regardless of what the agreement was, as long as it just gave Kissinger and Nixon a decent interval so they wouldn't be seen as responsible for the collapse of the South. The basic issues of the agreement were, and probably the biggest problem for Nixon was the location of NVA and Viet Cong troops in the south of the DMZ. Nixon, as well as the South Vietnamese president too, wanted the DMZ to be like a formal border, and so all of the NVA and VC units would go back over the DMZ. According to the agreement that Kissinger was negotiating, all North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops were allowed to remain in occupied areas of the South, which was a huge issue for Nixon. It was a huge issue for the South Vietnamese president too, as well. Two must recognize the NLF, or the PRG, the Provisional Revolutionary Government. The NLF means the National Liberation Front. This was like the South Vietnamese communist government, that was sort of a government in exile during war. And two had to acknowledge them as a legitimate political body. Of course, the returning of U.S. POWs, which was very important, and of course the signing of a ceasefire agreement. Nixon was particularly opposed to occupied areas of the South. He wants the DMZ as a formal demarcation point. But there's some real problems in this plan. For example, Nguyen Van Tu learns of the plan only by discovering captured enemy documents. And when the agreement is ultimately given to him to sign, it was not even in his first language. It was given to him in English. And it really demonstrated an unfair treatment on the part of Kissinger towards a country that was, regardless of problems, an ally of the United States. And instead, this agreement is negotiated in secret, without telling Tu, and Tu finds out, through the wrong way you'd want him to find out, and then he's basically told, "Here's the agreement, sign it," and he really had no ability to sort of really negotiate for the interests of South Vietnam. Here you see pictured South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Tu, who very much felt himself sold up the river by this plan. In November, the talks fell apart, and the United States, the North Vietnamese did not want to bend on certain areas, particularly the areas surrounding having the NVA and VC remain in occupied areas of the South. The Nixon administration kind of waffles. They give a list of a bunch of demands that the North Vietnamese absolutely cannot accept, and so the talks fall apart. Nixon's response was to bomb them. Nixon's response was to use what becomes known as the Christmas bombing to bomb North Vietnam, particularly around the areas of Hanoi and Haiphong, like they had never been bombed before. Nixon begins this campaign in December of 1972. His goal is to basically really show them a new level of American power and force, to force them to sign an agreement that was closer to the interests of the United States. Nixon's referred to as enacting Nazi-like aggression by the Swiss Prime Minister, and ultimately, by January 8th, 1973, the North go to the table and they sign the agreement with the United States. Tu is forced to agree. And the thing that allowed Tu to countenance agreeing to this was that Nixon pledged that he would bomb, if the North Vietnamese violate the treaty, that he will bomb them just like he bombed them during the Eastertide Offensive and just like he bombed them with the Christmas bombing. The problem? The agreement's the same agreement as the one before the bombing. There weren't actually any major changes on the issues that the United States, that the talks fell apart over back in November. So effectively, the talks fell apart. The United States launched a 10-day unprecedented bombing campaign, and then the North Vietnamese went and signed an agreement with the United States that was more or less the same agreement as the one that had been on the table and could have been signed before the Christmas bombing, more or less. And so effectively it was useless bombing. And and so it didn't really achieve it did result in a signing of the peace agreement, but it didn't result in any real fundamental transformation of the Paris Agreement. NVA and VC troops would still be allowed to remain in occupied areas of South Vietnam. The DMZ would not be a formal demarcation zone. Point. And of course, should two be worried? Nixon's pledge. Now, Kissinger and Nixon did not really see eye to eye. Kissinger, sought that decent interval. Nixon wanted to be there for his ally. Nixon really believed that if he needed to come to two's aid, he could come to his aid, and he could call in the B-52s to prevent any violation of the treaty that might result in a collapse of the South. But two should definitely be worried. The reason that two should be worried is really because the only person that's pledging this sort of, effort to potentially save South Vietnam if the North launches another offensive is really only Nixon. And Nixon was at the beginning of a very, very controversial period, of course, that will result in the revelations of massive illegal activities on the part of Nixon and will begin the demise of his presidency. In addition to Watergate, though, between 1970 and 1975, the Democratic-controlled House and Senate, they're trying to keep Nixon from doing what Nixon tells two he'll do. Bomb. They're basically trying to end this war. They do not want to bomb anymore. They want to stop the war. There were multiple efforts in Congress to limit the powers of the president. The Cooper-Church Amendment, which did not pass, it called for an end to the Cambodian bombing. The War Powers Resolution passed in 1973, though admittedly the War Powers Resolution in action over time has really been nothing more than, a congressional point of its right to oversight. The War Powers Resolution was designed to limit the power of the president to make war as commander-in-chief without a formal authorization from Congress. These were all a reaction to the long-term ramifications of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and the fact that Vietnam had become a huge, massive, undeclared war that, that members of Congress by the early 1970s felt they had really lost the ability to sort of act as a regulatory body in. By the end of 1973, as I mentioned, Congress is completely fed up. They don't want to authorize any more support for the war. Nixon promises bombing, but ultimately there's a huge reduction in aid coming to the South, and ultimately Nixon will, especially with Watergate, Nixon will ultimately have no ability to come to the aid when the final offensive is launched, to come to the aid of the South when the final offensive is lost. We also see an end of aid and bombing of Cambodia in this period. In 6 months of 1973, 250,000 tons of bombs fell on Cambodia. But shortly thereafter, the aid and the bombing would all be pulled out, and Cambodia will fall into civil war and ultimately be overrun by the Khmer Rouge. Should two be confident that if the North launches an offensive, Nixon will bomb? So Nixon's illegal activities will, of course, mean that he's not going to be around long enough to bomb in defense of Nguyen Van Thu's South Vietnam. Nixon was really, within his administration, maybe the only person who could assure that if the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive to defeat the South, as they would if they broke the ceasefire, as they would in 1975 with the Ho Chi Minh Offensive, Nixon promised that he would call in the B-52s and they would bomb the North Vietnamese units in the way they had with the Eastertide Offensive when they used Linebacker 1 to stop the Eastertide Offensive in 1972. So Nixon promised he would come in and bomb if the North Vietnamese broke the ceasefire. The problem is there's a myriad of illegal activities that are going to create huge domestic problems for the Nixon administration, ultimately leading to the beginning of the impeachment process and his subsequent resignation by the end of the summer 1974. This meant, of course, that that the United States would not intervene again in favor of the government of South Vietnam, the government of Nguyen Van Thu. There would be no B-52 bombing operations, as the individual who replaced Nixon would not even be his own vice president, but rather Gerald Ford, because his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign amid corruption charges associated with accepting bribes when he worked in Baltimore. And Gerald Ford simply did not have the political capital to order attacks to defend the South Vietnamese against the Ho Chi Minh Offensive of 1975. The illegal activities were things like the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg, the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg's doctor's residence. They were trying to steal Ellsberg's medical records. They wanted to smear him as being, mentally unstable, for example. Nixon conducted, like the Johnson administration, illegal wiretap programs. There was the illegal campaign slush fund that became a controversy as well. Illegal campaign funding issues. Spiro Agnew, of course, had to resign for taking bribes some years before his appointment to the vice presidency in 1969. There were also, for many, of the controversy of illegal uses of military force, at least as some members of Congress interpreted it, with, of course, the secret bombings of Cambodia in 1969 and also the Cambodian incursion. Of course, more than anything else, the biggest factor in the resignation of Nixon was, of course, Watergate. Watergate was a case where Nixon ran in 1972 against George McGovern, who was a more far-left Democratic candidate. And Nixon was the incumbent, and he was pretty popular in the country, relatively speaking. He had been the center of some real controversy, but he still had a very strong base of support. And Nixon wanted to understand the political strategy of his opponent. And so he had a group known as CREEP, which means the Committee to Re-elect the President, organize a break-in. The break-in organizers included individuals like G. Gordon Liddy, who would break into the Watergate office building, which was where the Democratic headquarters were, the national headquarters of the Democratic Party. And they would break in and they would bug the offices, and then this would allow them to be able to keep tabs on the political activities of Nixon's opponent. Of course, they went one time, they had to go back a second time because there was a mistake, and ultimately they're caught in the act. Individuals like G. Gordon Liddy. And over time, of course, Nixon, who kept tapes of everything in the White House, Nixon's personality was almost like a megalomaniac. He kind of wanted to control everything. He oftentimes overrode the authority of other members of his cabinet out of an attempt to kind of run the show his way and exclusively through him. And so he was constantly recording phone conversations, recording office conversations, so that he could kind of keep tabs on what people were saying in those meetings, to ensure that he could locate individuals that might not be, shall we say, in his best interest to be, serving with him. So he taped conversations throughout the White House, and of course these messages, these tapes, held the incriminating evidence that demonstrated that that Richard Nixon was intimately involved in the scandal, in the break-in of the Watergate office building, the Democratic headquarters. Of course, Nixon would eventually be asked by the special investigator Archibald Cox, who was investigating the situation. He was asked to turn over those tapes. He refused. He then asked to allow another politician to provide a transcribed version of the tapes. He sent some of the tapes in with areas deleted. And eventually, in the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, he would order his attorney general to fire Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor. The attorney general then refused and resigned in protest, and eventually it was the deputy who fired the attorney general in the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. Of course, eventually Nixon has to turn over everything. He is brought before impeachment process, and he will resign before being removed by impeachment in 1974. It's interesting when we look at this map, the last thing we look at here, this is how big a landslide it was for Nixon over McGovern. It was one of the most impressive landslide victories in the history of the United States. Nixon, of course, being represented in the red. And so in truth, everything associated with the Watergate break-in, I mean, even as it was illegal, it was even unnecessary. They did not really even need to seek any kind of special advantage. They had a huge advantage over McGovern in a fair race. But Nixon's desire to control everything, his sort of paranoid, almost maniacal personality, led him to make a decision that will ultimately destroy his presidency and really be a capstone for what becomes a narrative of corruption and scandal associated with the broader Vietnam War period, shall we say, the period from aspects of Kennedy's presidency through Johnson and then, of course, with Nixon.